I can hardly remember a time in my life without Halo. Halo's been a major part of my identity as a gamer. It's probably the only reason that I've been an Xbox player as long as I have. Halo 2 may have been my first exposure to this series, but Combat Evolved was the first entry that I experienced fully. As a 6-year-old, I was probably too young for it, but that didn't stop me from falling in love with Combat Evolved and the Halo series in general at such a young age. 17 years and countless playthroughs of each game later, and it's safe to say the series has made an impression both on me and on the gaming world at large. The first entry, Halo Combat Evolved, has developed quite a reputation over the last 20 plus years. It helped launch a major line of consoles and revolutionized home console first-person shooters. That's nothing to sneeze at, but if you know me, you know I always think it's worth re-examining something for what it is, for better or for worse. Halo 1's reputation does precede it, and I want to see whether that experience still holds up all these years later. 20 years is a long time, especially for video games. We've seen 3 more console generations since Halo hit shelves alongside the original Xbox in November 2001. The Halo series has taken on a life of its own, and though it's been through its fair share of ups and downs over the years, the franchise is still widely respected for its impact. As a 6-year-old playing through Halo 1, I couldn't properly articulate my feelings on the game, but today, I'm going to try and give this game the thoughtful examination that I think it deserves. But before we can tackle the what of the game, we have to tackle the why. Halo's development was a hectic one. The game we ultimately got in 2001 was far from the original vision of its developer, Bungie. Halo originally began its life as a real-time strategy game before pivoting to being a third-person shooter. The still unofficially titled game was developed in the late 90s with a computer release in mind, ideally for both Windows and Mac. The first footage of the game can be traced back to its unveil at Macworld in summer of 1999, a full 2.5 years before its ultimate release. Halo was obviously in a far more primitive state at this time, but it's notable just how much of the final game is present this far back. The opening of the cinematic shows the main character in a room very similar to the control room we see in the final game. The main character goes on to confront a pair of elites that aren't quite at their final form aesthetically. Aside from that, we see a lot of assets that are already in place this far back. Vehicles like the Banshee and the Warthog are present in the Macworld unveil, and in additional footage you see an early prototype of the Scorpion tank alongside Covenant weapons, including an early form of the plasma rifle and fuel rod gun, with a couple temporary sound effects that you'll recognize if you know Halo. 1 year later at E3, audiences would get a 10-minute glimpse of Halo, still a third-person shooter, but more in line with what the game will ultimately become. This is immediately notable based on the character models. The elites are much more in line with their final Halo 1 form, same with the look of the yet-to-be-named Master Chief. You get your first glimpse of your Marine allies in action against the Covenant before Master Chief takes the focus back for himself at the end of the trailer. I'm still bitter I can't wield the energy sword in the final game, if you can't tell. The E3 2000 showcase was another chance for Halo to make an impact, still needing to prove itself. At the same time, a cash-strapped Bungie was fielding offers for acquisition. Newly formed Microsoft Game Studios, needing software for their upcoming console, obliged. With the acquisition finalized in June of 2000, Halo became the high-priority title for this fledgling console. The decision was ultimately made by Bungie co-founder Jason Jones to transform Halo's core once again, this time into a first-person shooter. 20 years is a long time, but growing up during the peak of console shooters, it feels crazy to me that there was ever a point in my lifetime where FPSs were a rarity on consoles. Nintendo had found some success in the 90s with its partnership with Rare and the releases of both GoldenEye and Perfect Dark on the N64, but Halo would be an entirely different beast. Xbox's controller, infamously named the Duke, would have dual joysticks compared to the single stick on the N64. Sony's DualShock did predate the Duke, but Halo would be the first big step forward for dual console shooters if successful. With Halo's core changing yet again and a hard release date set, Bungie's time was limited. A collection of ideas had to become a full-price package meant to sell a new home console in record time. Bungie's other projects had to be scrapped, and it was all hands on deck to get Halo out the door. The originally planned open world was scrapped and ultimately abandoned by the series for the next 20 years before finally being implemented in Halo Infinite in 2021. The originally planned online multiplayer component was scrapped as well, only 4 months from release, due to Xbox Live not being ready for launch. The online component of the game would have to ultimately stay offline, and Bungie crunched hard to make sure the game could make its release date. Bungie ultimately achieved their goal, with Halo Combat Evolved releasing on store shelves on November 15, 2001, alongside the original Xbox console itself. It's safe to say things for gaming would never be the same again. From the first moment of its opening cinematic, Halo immediately set itself apart with its presentation. The opening shot immediately gives you a sense of scale, showing the titular ring world alongside the human ship where the first level will take place, the Pillar of Autumn. You're thrust right into the action, made aware that the humans are escaping one fight and about to enter another. We meet our captain, our trusty AI companion, and our playable character. With that out of the way, it's time to play.
Sir, I'm getting some calibration errors. I'm going to invert your looking pitch, so you can see if you like it better that way.
As an early dual-stick console FPS, it is understandable to have a tutorial section like this at the beginning of the game. You're walked through both normal and inverted up-down controls to show your different control options, but as someone who's played this game dozens of times, it would be nice to not be double-checked when I select normal up-down controls. With the tutorial out of the way, the Covenant finally attack and the game can get going. You immediately feel vulnerable in Combat Evolved. The first 2 crewmates you meet die in front of your very eyes, and you have to run through the ship helpless as you see the Covenant up close for the very first time. Master Chief meets Captain Keyes on the bridge, who informs Chief of his ultimate objective.
Get Cortana off this ship. Keep her safe from the enemy. If they capture her, they'll learn everything. Force deployment, weapons research, Earth.
Chief puts Cortana inside his head, which begins the core driving relationship of this franchise. Pillar of Autumn keeps things very simple. You're confined to the tight corridors of the ship and only face 2 Covenant enemy types, the Elites and the Grunts, the main soldiers and cannon fodder of the Covenant respectively. Weapons are also limited in this level. You get to use the assault rifle and pistol only from the human side. One key gameplay element is the ability to scavenge weapons on the battlefield, including those used by Fallen Covenant. The plasma pistol and plasma rifle are very effective against their shields. Later games make these weapons less effective for actually killing Covenant or other players online after their shields have been lowered, but in Halo 1 they're completely viable against any Covenant enemy, both to take down shields and to complete your kill. Later in the level, you get introduced to your motion tracker and your flashlight en route to the final stretch, where you get to blow the Covenant to smithereens with frag grenades. Frag grenades are crazy overpowered in Combat Evolved in particular. Grenades in general in Halo 1 seem to have more range than they would in any other entry, and the Covenant's plasma grenades, which you can stick enemies with to get an easy kill, also result in huge chain reactions that endanger both you and the enemy if you're not careful. You end up making a daring escape with Cortana and a squad of Marines in a lifeboat, destined to land on the mysterious ring world. Pillar of Autumn follows you down to the surface, and funnily enough, in the cinematic, the Autumn isn't actually moving. Once again, the game's presentation shines, as the movement of the camera helps compensate for the game's many technical limitations. Your lifeboat crashes on this mysterious ring world, and wouldn't you know it, you're the only survivor. The second level begins with you emerging to see the ring world for the first time, and the solitude you've achieved by the sense of scale here is commendable. It's also complemented by the haunting score. Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatori have been praised endlessly for their work in this entire franchise, but I can't go without talking them up even more, which I'm sure I'll probably continue to do throughout this entire video. The music at the start of this particular level still haunts me, even though the gameplay itself isn't particularly intense or frightening in this opening section. You make your way through the forest until you find a squad of Marines that have survived and make a stand against the Covenant. Here you meet a third enemy type, the Jackals. Jackals are bigger than Grunts, but smaller than Elites, and they have pesky shields that you have a small window to shoot in order to get them to retract their shields so you can kill them. Or if you're like me, you can just smash them with the butt of your gun, which I found more useful in this particular game. Just like the shielded Elites, plasma weapons are very effective at temporarily disabling Jackal shields in order to go in for the final kill. The second mission opens Halo up tremendously, widening the sandbox of available weapons and enemy types and allowing for greater exploration. The level is so massive by comparison that it lets you use a UNSC vehicle for the very first time, the Warthog. The Warthog is an iconic Halo vehicle, and though its best use would come later in this game, your first Warthog ride is still Combat Evolved at its best, the music swelling as you explore the vast world. The second half of the level is non-linear, allowing you to rescue 3 groups of surviving Marines in any order you desire. Cortana exposits throughout the level about the Pillar of Autumn, which has crashed on the ring, and the command crew, including Captain Keyes, has been captured and taken to a Covenant carrier ship. You round up all 3 groups of survivors in whatever order you desire, getting to use a sniper rifle for the first time in the process, a precursor to the next mission, the Truth and Reconciliation. This mission's all about the sniper rifle, almost to a fault. The trusty pistol is completely absent from this mission, the only mission in the game to do so, which encourages you to use other weapons throughout the lengthy adventure through the Covenant carrier. The opening section operates like a stealth section, where you can pick off the Covenant one by one with your sniper rifle to make your advance easier, but in my own experience, I've never been able to kill everybody in this section without being spotted at some point. As you can probably tell, I played the original Xbox version of Halo 1 for this review. The opening section of Truth and Reconciliation is where playing this version started to give me some problems. The first part of the level takes place at night, and visibility is extremely poor without the flashlight, which is an issue I don't have when I play this game on Master Chief Collection, for example. This happens throughout the game, especially in the later levels, which I think are worse offenders in this regard. I'm over-reliant on the flashlight throughout this game on the original Xbox version in a way I don't remember having to be when I played this version as a kid. I ultimately had to turn the brightness up on my capture card to ensure the footage was visible for this review. The second half of the level takes place aboard the Truth and Reconciliation itself, the Covenant carrier where the captain and his crew are captured. It's an enjoyable Belly of the Beast romp, but unfortunately this is where the game's level design begins to suffer. After rescuing the captain, the end of the level contains the first notable instance of backtracking in the game, as you lead Keyes and the remaining Marines back to the docking bay. You go back just the way you came, and with nothing really noteworthy happening in this last section, it ends up feeling like little more than padding to me. The narrative heavy lifting in this level happens in the cutscene after you find Keyes, where you finally start learning what the game is really about. The game crams a lot of exposition into this cutscene, and the developer commentary notes that this was a compromise to make up for a level that was cut, which was supposed to take place after this cutscene, which was meant to give the player the necessary exposition in a more organic manner. Instead, the captain tells us he overheard the Covenant talking about Halo, apparently in English because he could understand them.
They call it Halo.
One moment, sir. Accessing the Covenant BattleNet. According to the data in their networks, the ring has some kind of deep religious significance. If I'm analyzing this correctly, they believe that Halo is some kind of weapon, one with vast, unimaginable power.
That's true. The Covenant kept saying that whoever controls Halo controls the fate of the universe.
God, it really is fortunate that he overheard all that from his cell, huh? You escape from the ship with the captain in tow, and the UNSC regroups before heading out to find the Silent Cartographer, the map room that will reveal the location of Halo's control center before the Covenant do. The opening of this level is iconic, and for good reason. You quite literally storm the beach as the main Halo theme plays, and in this moment, the gameplay, the score, and the atmosphere all sync perfectly to deliver a quintessential Halo moment. It can't be overstated how great the Halo theme is, and how thankful I am that they don't overuse it in gameplay. This is an interesting level in that if you know the level, you can complete it quickly if you know what you're doing. Your first try entering the map room results in you being locked out and having to travel around the island to unlock the door remotely, but on a second playthrough you can simply go to unlock the door directly and save yourself a lot of time. In my experience watching speedruns of this level, this was done almost every time, and if you're just trying to get around the story stopping the game in its tracks, this is a good tactic. Either way you choose to approach the level, you will encounter hunters on multiple occasions. You first encountered hunters in Truth and Reconciliation, but in this level, you get to exploit their weaknesses with the greatest gift of all, the almighty pistol. It only takes one well-placed pistol shot to the exposed back of a hunter to kill them in Halo 1. It's a fun feature, but one that sort of represents Halo 1 to me. Fun in an ironic sense, almost in spite of itself at times. Realistically, a mini-boss like the hunters shouldn't be dispatched of so easily, and in my opinion, this feature was wisely left behind with Halo 1. Hunters would be at least slightly more difficult to kill on later games after this, and in Halo 5 they were turned into a full-fledged mini-boss. There's an unfortunate lack of tension in the hunter fights in this game compared to later entries, and it doesn't help that you encounter them on 4 separate occasions in this level alone. Things improve once you find the Cartographer, although the level itself ends with another instance of backtracking. The blow is lessened somewhat by the fact that an electric guitar version of the main theme, titled Rock Anthem for Saving the World, plays as you make your escape from the map room back to the surface. Unfortunately, even a shorter level like the Silent Cartographer falls victim to the repetitive nature of Combat Evolved, and if a short mission can feel like this, just imagine what a long mission feels like. Assault on the Control Room marks the halfway point of Halo 1's campaign, and it's one of the game's longest levels. It's a fascinating level in that there are essentially 3 distinct acts. Acts 1 and 3 are on foot through an endless sequence of samey interiors, with the odd exterior transition area here and there. Act 2, meanwhile, is a vehicle-focused section, where the level opens up from its claustrophobic beginning before closing back in on you. The second act of the level is by far the highlight, thanks in no small part to the introduction of the Scorpion tank. Vehicle handling is not one of Combat Evolved's strong suits, but it's enjoyable enough to make sections like this some of the game's most memorable. The vehicles also extend to the Covenant in this level. You fight against Covenant Banshees, their aerial vehicle, Wraiths, the Covenant tank, and Ghosts, their mid-level ground vehicle, which you're able to commandeer yourself in this mission if you want. Vehicles feel very inconsistent in Halo 1. In future games, the damage is absorbed more by the vehicle and less by the player. In Halo 1, the player absorbs most of the damage inflicted by enemies, even while in a vehicle, meaning the vehicle has a lot of durability at the expense of the player rather than the other way around. I prefer the way later games handle vehicles in this regard, both in terms of durability and handling, but their inclusion is still welcome in Halo 1 to help break up the pacing in levels like this. This mission is also notable for being the last mission in the game with an abundance of allies. You rescue Fireteam Zulu, the Marines on the ground, right before finding the tank, unless you were me during this playthrough who accidentally let everyone die before I could even get in the tank. In later levels, you get the occasional help from Sentinels or you'll meet a few Marine stragglers, but for all intents and purposes, you're alone for the second half of Combat Evolved. The mission mercifully ends with Chief and Cortana finally reaching the control room for what I can only assume is another jam-packed cutscene that's forced to make up for a cut level. Cortana seems overwhelmed at the knowledge that the control room is giving her, and the developer's commentary mentions something very interesting here. In the early drafts of the script, this scene was supposed to lead to Cortana becoming a villain gone mad with power, but Staten, O'Donnell, and Jones laughed it off as something that would be a very bad look for the female lead of this franchise. So it's a good thing they never did that, right?
Captain, we've got to stop the captain.
Keys? What
The
are we...
weapons cache he's looking for, it's not really... We can't let him get inside.
I don't understand.
There's no time. Get out of here, find keys, stop him. Before it's too late!
It's understandable why the cutscene is this way. The next level is supposed to give us a huge reveal, and to have Cortana with you for that reveal would sap the moment of its tension, but there had to be a better compromise than this. Next thing you know, you're in a dark swamp near Key's last transmission point from over 12 hours prior. The mission that follows is the highlight of the entire game in terms of story. 343 Guilty Spark masterfully builds an eerie mood throughout the first half of the level. Things just feel off the entire time. The only enemies you encounter on your way down to the Forerunner facility are cannon fodder, jackals, and grunts. You see friendly blips on your motion tracker, but as you approach them, there is nobody there. You see what seem to be friendlies in the distance, but they're gone when you approach them as well. Random explosions are happening all around you as you make your way inside and down an elevator shaft. Things aren't much better inside the facility. Green blood drips through the ceilings and bodies and loose ammo are strewn everywhere. You encounter a lone Marine who seems to have gone mad, shooting at you if you get too close.
You're not turning me into one of those things! I'll blow your brains out!
You finally find a helmet belonging to a Private Jenkins and uses video logs to put the pieces together. The captain and his crew were attacked by something, but what? You know something's gone totally wrong, but you don't get to see it until Master Chief does. First, you see the infection forms, then you see the combat forms, ones who've infected humans or elites. Your goal now is just to escape and desperately hope to regroup, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. You have to use the remnants of the facility that are still intact to make your way through. Luckily, you're aided in combat by the first appearance of the trusty shotgun, an absolute must for fighting the Flood. The weakness of the Flood combat rears its ugly head here before becoming a total irritant in the rest of the game. Ultimately, the only weapons you really need to fight the Flood are the shotgun and the pistol. The shotgun's obviously deadly in close quarters, and the pistol is good for headshots, which you can still clearly hit even on the Flood, and you're sure to get plentiful amounts of ammo for these weapons throughout. Like the rest of the game, other weapons are still viable against the Flood, but these two are hands down the two primaries you'll want to have on hand to fight Halo's equivalent of zombies. At the end of the level, you find a different squad of Marines and exit the facility. You seem to be finally regrouping for extraction until you're suddenly teleported and greeted by...
Greetings. I am the monitor of Installation 04. I am 343 Guilty Spark. Someone has released the Flood. My function is to prevent it from leaving this installation, but I require your assistance. Come, this way.
In a very quick cutscene, he introduces himself as 343 Guilty Spark, and you're immediately whisked away to your next gameplay scenario. You know the one. The library is infamous for many reasons, but it's always been a level that I thought got a bit of a bad rap among the community. After this playthrough, I'd like to apologize on behalf of my past self. Playing Halo 1 with a critical eye for its pacing and variety made me see this level's shortcomings more than I ever had before. From a narrative standpoint, there's really nothing happening. You get some exposition from the monitor, but it's largely inconsequential. There's some good characterization of the monitor in this level, I will say. He leaves you by yourself to go do a lot of other things, he talks to himself constantly, and he's always quick to remind you that he's a genius. It's amusing, but is it enough to justify this level being what it is? I don't think so, and I think you can tell by the sound of my voice. So what actually is this level? Well, your objective is to get to the top of the library and retrieve the index that you need to use to activate Halo, which is the monitor's goal, and from what he tells you, is your goal too. He tells you that activating Halo will destroy the Flood, and that's all Master Chief needs to hear. The level itself is basically Chief making a big rectangle around one floor of the library, fighting the same Flood types over and over again, before climbing on an elevator and going up one floor at a time. Rinse and repeat 4 times until you finally get to the top and retrieve the index. Remember how I said the Flood's combat limitations would really be exposed in this level? The Flood's only real tactic is the Swarm, which already makes them less interesting to fight than the Covenant. The Infection and Carrier Forms don't really fight you directly, and they're easy enough to dispatch of. The Carrier Forms will explode once they land wherever they land, which you have to watch out for, but they don't do anything to you in combat. The Infection Forms can eat away at your shields and your health, but you can also dispatch them easily. This is one area where the Assault Rifle comes in handy against them if you want to use it instead of a pistol or a shotgun. The only Flood that fight you directly are the Combat Forms, which either shoot at you from a distance, swarm you and smack you around, or they'll shoot you way back from the distance with a rocket launcher in the second half of the game, and the rocket flood will make you want to pull your hair out and throw your controller at the screen. Killing a rocket flood often makes them fire one last rocket, and you really can't judge their trajectory, whether they're alive or dead. It's not fun to fight against, and it feels like a coin toss whether you'll actually dispatch them easily or get unavoidably killed. If anything I just described sounds fun to you, then this might be the mission for you, but it's safe to say it was not the mission for me. There are two things that make this level even more infuriating to me. First, the chapter titles for each trip up the elevator make you well aware that the developers knew this level was tedious and that they chose to mock you with that fact. Padding my game like this is hardly something I would flaunt. Additionally, the library is the last original location you explore in the game. The last three missions see you trudging back through the environments of Assault on the Control Room, the Truth and Reconciliation, and the Pillar of Autumn in reverse, with a few minor alterations. The library might be a bit easier for me to stomach if more were happening in the story, but really, nothing happens on Chief's way to his objective. He simply gets his objective, obtains it, and then moves right on. And where does he move on to? Back to the control room, of course, with the monitor and the index now in tow. Before you can activate the ring, your old pal Cortana intervenes. She explains that the monitor has been manipulating the Chief, and that Halo's real purpose isn't to kill the Flood, but to kill their food, every being in the galaxy. Once the monitor realizes he can't count on the Chief, he and his sentinels turn on him.
We can't let the monitor activate Halo. We have to stop him. We have to destroy Halo. According to my analysis of the available data, I believe the best course of action is somewhat risky. An explosion of sufficient size will help destabilize the ring, and will cut through a number of primary systems. We need to trigger a detonation on a large scale, however. A starship's fusion reactors going critical would do the job.
Before they can do that, Chief needs to blow up 3 generators to prevent the monitor from activating Halo remotely. Remember earlier when I talked about the 3-act structure of Assault on the Control Room? Yep, you guessed it. You've got to go back through each section of that exhaustingly long level to destroy these 3 generators. You essentially play through the level in reverse with a few new detours. Unfortunately, this level's repetitive nature extends to the score as well. Marty O'Donnell said that the score was designed to match the gameplay moment to moment, which I do feel throughout a lot of this game, but in 2 Betrayal, so much of the score from previous levels is reused that it feels like they just had to have some music there and inserted random tracks at random points. It doesn't feel that the tracks are matching any specific motifs here like they did in previous levels. Not that the music isn't still excellent, which it absolutely is. And that's not to say there aren't good moments of gameplay in 2 Betrayals either. You do get to use a Banshee in this level, which helps mix things up a bit. One welcome change in this level, and for the rest of the game, is that you'll be fighting both the Covenant and the Flood simultaneously, and these 2 factions fight each other as well as you. You can hang back and let them take each other out for a while if you want, you can try and skirt around them, or you can just embrace the chaos and try and kill everybody. It makes things a bit more interesting combat-wise than just fighting the Covenant or just fighting the Flood would be. From a story perspective, there is a novelty in seeing areas that were previously pristine being decayed thanks to the Flood. It shows the effect they've had beyond what you've seen within the gameplay. It still isn't enough to forgive the last 3 missions of the game basically just being backtracking though. Much like the library, there is no story progression once you get your objective at the beginning of the level. After this point, there is no dialogue until the very end of the mission. I don't need exposition constantly screamed in my ear like Halo 5 does too often, but I would like it to feel like the gameplay itself isn't entirely padding for the story. In my opinion, properly weaving story and gameplay together is ideal, and Halo 1 usually ends up handling the 2 separately. The story we have at this point also feels rather slapdash. This level's closing cutscene is one that the developers could only laugh at in their commentary.
This is ridiculous. Yeah, we're like trying to, how do you disable the power cores? How do we do that? There's got to be explosives, there's got to be an explosion.
You just walk into
What could possibly happen? Wait, why don't we just walk into a big glowy light? If we walk into the lens flare.
Here comes the best exposition of the game. Of course there is.
That's how the monitor moves about so quickly.
That's how the monitor was about. Okay, yeah.
Listen to how fast Jen is talking.
Yeah, because you wrote this like in the last second before she showed up. What?
Jen's saying, what the hell are you people making me read?
I'm pretty sure I can pull it from your suit without permanently damaging your sheet.
Pull it from your suit? Only once.
Well,
why is that, Joe? So how are you going to like distract people from saying, why haven't you been using this method of
let
transportation
me just
this
say
whole
the
time?
worst cinematic in the game, which is what we just saw, is actually bookended by the best cinematic in the game.
The final stages of the campaign had to be thrown together to give us some kind of ending, and to get the game to a certain length. Do what you gotta do, I guess. The game's penultimate level begins with some banter between Chief and Cortana, some welcome levity after the last 3 levels, which were either haunting or just draining due to their length and repetitiveness. Unfortunately, this banter comes at a bad time. Immediately after this, you get a transmission from the captain aboard the Truth and Reconciliation.
Don't be a fool. Leave me.
Captain? Captain? I've lost him.
Key's demise feels like the game's true lowest point. Chief and Cortana's only remaining ally with any plot relevance, and he has perhaps the most brutal death of all. Cortana's emotions are well realized in Key's death scene, meant to show the horrors of the situation and the disbelief at the lengths that they need to go to save the day. The opening cutscene has some interesting dialogue from Cortana. She explains that the Covenant tried to take their ship and leave the ring so the Flood couldn't use it to escape the ring themselves, but they were grounded aboard the now disabled Truth and Reconciliation. The second half of the game also serves as a bit of a recontextualization of the Covenant. Their goals and the Chiefs are now essentially one and the same thanks to the Flood, but things are too far gone for them to be allies just yet. The mission itself thankfully plays out as a more abbreviated version of Truth and Reconciliation. It gives you plenty of shortcuts to get to the captain faster this time around, which is much appreciated. You escape the Covenant's ship on a Banshee, and it's finally time to finish the fight. The opening cutscene of the game's last mission, the Maw, begins with a long pan around the ground at Pillar of Autumn, a far cry from the opening shot and a good juxtaposition to show how far we've come. This version of the Autumn is probably the best showcase of the decay that's caused by the Flood and the conflict on the ring. You fight your way through the familiar tight corridors, encountering both the Covenant and the Flood this time around until you reach the deserted bridge. Cortana tries to start the countdown to blow up the ship's reactor, but she's stopped by the Monitor, who's made his way aboard somehow. You have to fight your way through to, thankfully, some new areas of the ship. In engineering, Chief has to destroy 4 exhaust manifolds with some well-placed grenades or rockets to blow up the ship. Now, I've played this mission numerous times, and I still haven't been able to master these explosions. The game seems to decide on a whim whether your timing and placement of your grenades is good enough, and it can also be difficult to make the proper jumps to get where you need to get, leading to a seemingly endless cycle of falling down and having to scavenge for grenades before climbing all the way back up to destroy a manifold. Once you finally destroy all 4 manifolds, it's time for the legendary Warthog run. Well, sort of. First, Cortana contacts Echo 419, who's apparently been on station this whole time, but Chief and Cortana haven't thought to contact her until now. She agrees to pick you up and you begin making your way to the rendezvous point in a Warthog. Once you arrive, you see Fohammer being shot down by Banshees in the distance. As you watch your final remaining ally go down in smoke, there's only one thing left for you to do: floor it. This is where the famous Warthog run really begins. With the Halo theme booming in the background, the enemies fleeing, explosions everywhere around you, and time working against you, the adrenaline really starts to flow. There's, conveniently and very luckily, one last broadsword fighter still docked, and Chief and Cortana are able to make their daring escape away from the ship and off the ring just in time to watch the Autumn explode, fracturing the Halo ring. Chief and Cortana look on at the remnants of the ring, and Cortana informs them that they're all that's left of the human forces on the ring.
Halo. It's finished.
No. I think we're just getting started.
And we leave our heroes stranded in the middle of space, awaiting their next adventure. Before I give my final thoughts on Combat Evolved's campaign, I do want to address its remaster, Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. I played the Xbox 360 version of the game once, but most of my Halo 1 playthroughs have been on Master Chief Collection. Today, MCC is undoubtedly the best way to play all the games on it, especially if you have a good PC or one of the new Xbox consoles. As a Series X player, each entry feels buttery smooth to play through. I ultimately decided to play my original Xbox copy of Combat Evolved on my 360 through its backwards compatibility so I could play as close to the original version of the game as I could for footage. The differences between the two versions, while mostly limited to the superficial, really do feel like different games at times. Anniversary fills the frame with more visual noise, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Everything's much brighter and cleaner generally, and it's overall a good-looking game. The remastered score is something that I can personally take or leave, and in MCC I will usually choose the option to have the classic audio on. Where Anniversary falters for me is in its atmosphere. The game looks pretty, but sometimes that can be to a fault. I spoke at length earlier about how effective I find the mood and atmosphere of 343 Guilty Spark to be. The dark, dreary swamp combines beautifully with the eerie score and the barren areas to create a really effective tone of horror for that level. Anniversary turns the eerie swamp into a bright, vibrant rainforest, which hampers the mood of the level quite a bit and ultimately affects the tone. As a general rule, I want my games to be visible, and there are points in the original game where I don't like how low the visibility is, but in a mission like 343 Guilty Spark, I accept it because it enhances the mood so well. That's lacking in Anniversary, and the later missions also falter in a similar way. The Forerunner facilities and Anniversary graphics look too clean and polished for my personal liking, and the final 3 missions don't convey the decay of Halo as much as I would like them to. It feels more obvious that the developers just slapped some effects onto the environments rather than convincing me that the environments have been altered by the flood itself. I probably sound more upset about all this than I actually am, but it is an area in both Halo 1 and 2 Anniversary that I get annoyed by. Remasters are an opportunity to enhance the original version of the game, and sadly these remasters feel like they transform the original games more than they enhance them. These are ultimately minor gripes, but I did want to discuss the changes a bit. All in all, it's still Halo 1. You can absolutely play this for the very first time with Anniversary graphics and sound, and I doubt the overall effect would be much different on you. Just as someone who's played these games for a long time, it's hard to not be attached to certain aspects that I know so well. As we wrap up the campaign, this is a good opportunity to discuss some of the game's broader points. I went into what the game's like from moment to moment and level to level, but what about painting the full picture? Well, let's start with the art style. Halo's art style didn't really undergo a massive shift until 343 Industries took over for Halo 4, and the series largely stuck with similar assets from 1 all the way up until Reach. Each game brought new enemy variants, weapons, and locations of course, but the core style felt largely unchanged. I've personally always loved the aesthetic of Bungie-era Halo, and Combat Evolved is a big reason why. Obviously I have my grievances about some of the changes to Combat Evolved Anniversary, but it's good looking overall like I said. It's a losing battle for a game to hold up spotlessly graphically after 20 years, but if the art style is good, that's what ultimately matters to me. Some limitations can't be avoided, but it's what you do in spite of them that counts most. Even though Combat Evolved reuses levels too frequently, each unique location the game drops you in feels just that, unique. The UNSC's interiors are different from the Covenant interiors, and they're both different from the interiors of the Forerunner structures. Areas you visit on the Halo ring have different weather patterns and different environments. You go through a forest, a beach, snowy mountains, a desert, a swamp. The variety in locations helps prevent the game from being more repetitive than it already is, and levels hold up really well aesthetically, particularly 343 Guilty Spark and Halo. And as I said earlier, even the reused locations benefit from being able to use the release of the Flood to alter their environments in a way that benefits the story. Speaking of story, let's wrap that one up as well. I've seen a lot of people say the Halo games have had great stories over the years. There's probably a time when I totally agree with that as well. And today, I can't say I entirely disagree with it, but storytelling in the Halo series can be quite a mixed bag at times. Combat Evolved would be the start of that, but it's not to say it has a bad story by any stretch. It's just not a particularly dense one. There are only 4 characters with any plot relevance: Chief, Cortana, Keyes, and Guilty Spark. The Covenant don't have any specific characters that they give any focus to, nor does the Flood. The game's setup is very simple. Don't let the Covenant find Earth. The dynamic is a simple one. Don't shoot at the good guy humans, do shoot at every bad guy alien that you see. Halo 1 isn't concerned about characterization of anyone really, and it doesn't necessarily need to be. It doesn't ask you to ponder the ethics of your main characters or to examine anything that's happening critically from a storytelling standpoint. As someone with way too much time on my hands and a film degree, I love examining everything way too critically, so I should hate how basic Halo 1 is, but I don't. Halo 1 is incredibly simple, but that works to the game's benefit. It wants you to just be along for the ride and to have fun. Whether I think it always succeeds in that goal from a gameplay perspective is another discussion, but I never doubt the game's intent, and I can't say the approach doesn't work overall. Combat Evolved feels like a proof of concept to me, showing the potential of the universe and its many possibilities. Sure enough, they would begin to expand in Halo 2, and the stories would begin maturing along with their audience as they went along. Judging Combat Evolved strictly as a starting point for something more down the line, it's a fun time that doesn't take itself too seriously, and when it does so effectively. At the end of the day, I can say that the story only progressing in a select few cutscenes feels lazy. I can say that it lacks development in any of its main characters. I can say that only showing one side of the conflict limits the game's storytelling. I can certainly say all these things, and I will. What I can also say is that sometimes examining something critically is less important than letting it take you along for the ride, and I can't deny that Halo 1's campaign, for good or for bad, was always a ride. I've had very different experiences with Halo 1's campaign and multiplayer. I've played the campaign throughout my life, but I had not touched the multiplayer component until I played Master Chief Collection in 2015. Multiplayer in Combat Evolved did not have the luxury of being part of Xbox Live, and as a result, you'd need to do split screen or system link to play the game with friends. Campaign co-op is also an option in the multiplayer menu, and it's how I first beat the game back in 2005 thanks to my older cousin. The game's main multiplayer component, as mentioned earlier, was the area that received the least development time. There are 13 maps present in Combat Evolved on the Xbox, including classics like Hang 'em High and Blood Gulch. There's also a wide variety of existing modes to choose from. Considering the limited development time that the multiplayer component had, there is far more content here than you might first expect. Halo 1's map selection would be expanded thanks to its PC port by Gearbox Software, which added mostly big team battle maps to the game. As someone who didn't even know what the series was until well after Halo 2 came out, and with friends that didn't get into Halo until the Xbox 360 era, I've never been able to play the original version of Halo 1's multiplayer. Instead, all my Halo 1 multiplayer experiences come on Master Chief Collection. It's by far my least played multiplayer component of any game in the series as a result, but that doesn't mean there isn't still fun to be had in Halo 1's multiplayer. It really is impressive how fun the game actually can be when you factor in all its limitations. Even the annoying mechanics here are almost part of the charm of the game. Take the pistol for example. In campaign, it's a solid headshot weapon, and if your aim is really good, you can use it against any enemy viably. In multiplayer, the pistol is the absolute only way to go. When you spawn, you always spawn with the assault rifle, but ask any player who knows Halo 1 well and they'll tell you that they immediately switch to their pistol when they spawn. It's a 3-shot kill if you can effectively aim your headshots, and while it's still easier said than done, it's by far the most viable strategy in a traditional game mode on a small or medium-sized map. Does this make the experience rather one-dimensional? Absolutely. Does it mean it's not fun? Absolutely not. One-dimensional may be the most apt descriptor of Halo 1's multiplayer, for better or for worse. There's a definite charm to this game, but it can also be grating if you play it too much. It gets repetitive when all 8 or 16 players are just going for headshots with the same weapon ad nauseum, and unfortunately, the maps don't lend much variety to the game. The abbreviated development period meant that the maps in Halo 1 were very simple and were largely symmetrical with one main gimmick. Take the classic Blood Gulch for example. You're in a big canyon with a base on either side. Sidewinder, you're in a big snowy U-shaped tundra with a base at either end. Hang 'em High is a symmetrical map with raised platforms throughout and similar structures to climb through and reach the top. Most of the maps share this level of simplicity, and while being simple isn't inherently a bad thing, it doesn't lend itself to much interesting strategy. It's still most viable to have a pistol on a medium map and to post up with a sniper rifle on a big team map thanks to how vulnerable players are when they're in vehicles. Big team maps are the most frustrating to play on in my opinion. The maps are so big that you'll often be walking through the level for minutes on end before you even encounter another enemy player, and when you die you have to go all the way back to your own base and make the big hike back if you're not fortunate enough to have a vehicle with you at your base. The alternative is to wait for vehicle spawns, which also means a lot of sitting around doing nothing. After a few games of big team, I'm frankly always ready to stop playing Halo 1's multiplayer. Multiplayer in Combat Evolved is like the campaign. I can understand why it's the way it is, and I can appreciate the effort that was put into it, but that doesn't mean I can totally forgive it. There's fun to be had, but so many factors hold it back. The map design makes games drag more often than not. The spawning really doesn't feel refined either. On close quarters maps, you're often spawned right into the middle of combat. It's not at all uncommon for me to die within 2 seconds of respawning. Depending on what map and mode you're on, you always seem to spawn too close or too far away from the action, leaving a constant sense of frustration. MCC also just doesn't feel like the ideal way to play Halo 1 multiplayer either. It's by far the most difficult game to find online matches with. I had to sit for over a half hour searching for a big team game. At a certain point, I just hopped in the custom game browser to find a match. It made capturing footage more difficult than I'd hoped, and as a result, I wasn't able to play on all the maps during my time getting footage. It seems like System Link on the original Xbox truly was the ideal way to play multiplayer, as getting 16 players who knew each other in a room together to enjoy the game sounds like a much more reliable way to have fun than 16 randoms who can quit at any time, especially in custom games. My experience capturing footage ended up largely consisting of lopsided big team games. This, along with the one-dimensional gameplay of the 4v4 games, is unfortunately my lasting impression of Halo 1's multiplayer. When it's cooking, it's fun, but there are just too many factors holding it back. Thankfully, much like Master Chief, Bungie was just getting started. When I set out to cover this game, I had the goal of answering how this game felt to play today. So how does it feel to play today? Well, I've played Combat Evolved a lot in my life, particularly since I got Master Chief Collection in 2015. I've always felt that while the rest of the games hold up well from a gameplay perspective, Combat Evolved was the only one that didn't fully. After this playthrough, while I can say it doesn't feel as good to play as the rest of the series, Combat Evolved is still totally enjoyable. There are some annoyances here and there, low jumps, wild grenades, ho-hum vehicle handling, and repetitive level design, but ultimately it's still really fun to just shoot at the Covenant. The Flood, not so much, but the levels where you fight both do make things a bit more interesting. Combat isn't as dynamic thanks to a limited sandbox of weapons and enemies, but Combat Evolved is a good blueprint that the rest of the series, and many first-person shooters that followed, would build and improve on. It can't be overstated just how important Halo Combat Evolved was to first-person shooters, and I'll never avoid giving credit where it's due. But just because something's important and influential doesn't mean we can't examine it critically. When examining this game critically, I find a lot to not enjoy today, but the pros do still outweigh the cons here, and that goes for both the campaign and the multiplayer. Multiplayer, despite everything working against it, is a fun inclusion. It, much like Combat Evolved as a whole, would be perfected down the line, but the important building blocks were here this far back. Gamers of a certain age undoubtedly got and are still getting so much out of the multiplayer, whether they play it online or can still play on a couch with a group of friends on their original Xboxes. Halo Combat Evolved may not be quite a masterpiece in my eyes, but it certainly earned its reputation as a classic. Its imperfections are human, the result of a rushed development, but I never doubt that the developers did all they could to make the best of a bad situation, and I can't say they didn't succeed. Unfortunately, making the best out of a bad situation would also define the next entry in the series, one that changed my life forever. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for Halo 2.